And I have got right at 3 o'clock, so we are going to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to join us. I am Teresa Lyson, a business solutions consultant here at NICC, and I'm excited today to introduce our first webinar in our Instructor webinar series. We will be offering free 30-minute webinars on the second Monday of each month. Watch NICC BCS on social media and e-newsletters for future webinars. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared. For those who registered for the webinar with Kate Teisber, we did have a change in the schedule, and she will be presenting at the webinar on November 11th. Today, we will hear from Molly Mackey, who will talk about psychological safety and the key to team performance and retention. Molly is the founder of LEADERNship Institute, with over 18 years of business and speaking experience, with a passion for business, strategy, leadership, and learning. Molly believes that by intentionally intersecting the ongoing journeys of leadership and learning, we can create better leaders. If you have any questions throughout Molly's presentation, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Molly may have asked you to join us in the chat box a little bit during the webinar, but we will save time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions. Look in the chat box for Molly's handout that should be attached. And with that, I will turn it over to Molly.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you for everybody in the chat that's introducing themselves. So I always like to start off with why I do what I do. So maybe you've had this experience, maybe you haven't, where you've had a couple days off and you've spent it doing things that you enjoy with people you love. And then the night before work hits, and there's that rock in your gut and a tightness in your chest, and your head starts spinning and you don't want to go back to work. And it's not your job, you're good at your job, and it's not your coworkers, you like them. It's your boss, whether they micromanage you or take credit for your projects, or maybe they're just a jerk. So I don't believe anybody should have to go through that. Like Teresa mentioned, I believe that if we intertwine leadership and learning, we can create better leaders, and better leaders equal better lives. So thank you for taking your time to be here this afternoon. We know that the best leaders are learners. And if there was one thing that I wish every single team and leader could understand, it's psychological safety. So I'm excited to be here with you this afternoon. And I will be asking for a little bit of participation throughout here. We will go ahead and start. All right. So if I were to ask everyone, and I know you can't, just to get up and dance for a couple minutes, what would be some of your first thoughts? Nope, I'm not going to do it. I want to embarrass myself. So anytime I talk about psychological safety, we always have to lay the foundation for interpersonal fear, interpersonal risk. So what is that? If you think about it, we evolved to be social animals. As humans, we're not the fastest animals, we're not the strongest, but we evolved because we were able to work together. So that means we were adapted to care what people think about us because it meant our survival. We also know that our brains perceive interpersonal fear, interpersonal risk, the same way that we do physical safety risks. We also know that when people feel isolated or they feel humiliated, it lights up the same parts of the brain that physical pain does. So a lot of times when I coach new leaders, they say, "Oh, my door is always open. Why don't people come to me with questions or ideas?" It's because of this concept of interpersonal fear and interpersonal risk. We don't want to make a fool out of ourselves. So a lot of times we don't bring up ideas. So what is psychological safety? Psychological safety means we can come in, we can show our true, unique selves without fear of negative consequences. It's an idea that we can take risks, we can try new ideas. In psychologically safe teams, people feel accepted, they feel respected, and there's that considerate candor within the team. So where did the original research come from this? So Amy Edmondson was a researcher. She was actually going for her PhD in the 1990s. And she had a theory. Her theory was that high performing teams made less mistakes than low performing teams, which is a pretty intuitive thesis. So she joined a research group that was actually studying medication errors at hospitals. And she describes in her third book, when she got her research back, her heart just sunk. It was correlated, but not in the way that she thought. The high performing teams were making just as many, if not more, mistakes than low performing teams. So she did what a lot of us might do. She said, you know what? I'm going to repeat my experiment. I don't think my thesis is wrong. So she hired her own research assistant. She did a experiment on a grander scale. And again, she got the research back, and the high performing teams were making just as many or reporting just as many, if not more, mistakes than the low performing teams. So in the chat, if you could put, why would that be? Why were the high performing teams reporting just as many, if not more, mistakes than the low performing teams? What would cause that? Again, you can put your ideas in the chat. Yeah, absolutely, Stacy. They were comfortable making the mistakes and reporting. Yeah, because we're human, that too, Randy. Wonderful. Yeah, the high performing teams, they were comfortable reporting their mistakes and they were used as learning opportunities versus reasons to punish folks. In the low performing teams, what was happening, they were concealing their mistakes because they were afraid they would get punished for them. So her research didn't get a whole lot of attention. It was reported in some academic journal that most of us will never read. Maybe you will. But it wasn't until Google did their Aristotle project from 2012 to 2016, they were looking for the key to team performance. And they said, you know what? We're going to find the algorithm. We're going to find the key. We're going to find the best team ever. So they had 180 different teams within their organization. And they studied their age, education, experience, how often they had lunch together. I always joke, probably height and weight. If you could put it on a spreadsheet, they put it on a spreadsheet. They got their data back and they couldn't find one single thread that was consistent through all of them until one of the researchers actually stumbled upon Amy Edmondson's research. And they said, that's it. Every single one of our high performing teams has a high degree of psychological safety. So since then, there's been a ton of other research from Harvard Business Review to Forbes to Accenture really showing that when people feel psychologically safe within a team, it's really that key to team performance. Now, Tim Clark actually did some additional research, kind of piggybacking off Amy Edmondson's research. And he said, okay, is it an all or nothing thing, or are there levels of psychological safety? So if we have respect on one axis and permission on the other, we look at if people don't feel like they're part of a team, they feel excluded. Right? We want people to feel included. When they feel safe, like they're included within the team, then they feel safe to learn. When they feel safe to learn, they can feel safe to contribute. Now, not a whole lot of teams actually get up to this challenger safety mark. Challenger safety means we can challenge the status quo. We can try something different. We can do something different than we've always done. What percentage of teams would you guys guess actually get up to that challenger safety mark? If you could put in the chat, what percentage do you think actually get up to that challenger safety? All right, we've got some good guesses here. It's so they depends on the country, but it's only between 5 and 10%. So most of you are right in the chat. Think about that. Think about how many good ideas we're missing out on because people don't feel safe to speak up. So anytime I do soft skills work, whether it's emotional intelligence or conflict or psychological safety, inevitably when I'm pitching training to different organizations, there's always a CFO that says, okay, show me the money. How does this affect my bottom line? We know that teams that are psychologically safe have a reduction in turnover. They have more engagement. Their team members are less stressed. They have more life satisfaction. They're more productive. And there's a 41% decrease in safety incidents. Those are some pretty significant numbers just for having psychologically safe teams. So how do we create that? And that's what we're going to talk about today. This has been adapted. Usually this presentation is anywhere from 60 minutes to 3 hours. We've got about 20 minutes. So I'm just going to try to give you the nuts and bolts of the presentation. So within psychologically safe teams, people value each other's contributions. They care about each other's well-being, not just as a team member, but as an entire person. They also have input into how the team carries its work out, and there's an expectation for considerate candor. Now, you can be candid, which means you're very direct and be a jerk about it, but you can also be considerately candid with folks. And that comes from a place of respect. We challenge each other's ideas, we care about how we do the work. One of my favorite quotes from Amy Edmondson is problem solving is a team sport. That means we compete with each other instead of against each other. We're all looking for the best solutions that we can within our team. So, how do we create psychological safety? If we know that people have that interpersonal fear, interpersonal risk, and don't just want to come out with ideas, how do we as leaders create that within our organization? And I'll give you 4 steps today that you can take back and use within your organization. And we'll go through each one of these. The first one is ask and pause. And I'll tell you a story. The other day, I was on a coaching call with a director of a human service organization. And she's one of these people that's always like on 10. This time she was like on 20. She's like, oh, I'm so frustrated. And I was like, Erica, what's going on? I've been with her for years, and I've never seen her that frustrated before. And she said, my payee quit. And I said, I've been with you and your entire leadership team has quit before. Why? What's going on? She said, my payee quit. And our process was we had this 1-page budgeting sheet that she was supposed to fill out. We've got 75 to 100 different payee clients. So they're payees for folks that have intellectual disabilities and also those that have been diagnosed with mental health issues. And she said she didn't use it. She created her entire other system. She said, I've got 75 clients that I don't know where their money's at. And she's like, you know what I'm going to do? And I was like, what are you going to do, Erica? And she's like, I'm going to go out to all of my team. I'm going to ask them what their pain points are. And I'm going to ask them what they're struggling with. And I said, I think that's a good idea. She said, really? And I said, absolutely. I said, obviously, they're not comfortable right now coming to you, even with the small things. She was too embarrassed as a payee to tell you what she was struggling with. So go out and ask them. As leaders, we want to ask, hey, what are you struggling with? What do you need to get your job done? Make it a point to actively solicit feedback from the team. Be able to pause for reflection. Be able to let your team members speak before you throw out your ideas. A lot of times leaders will come in and they have a problem and they'll just throw out a solution. What happens? People are like, well, they've already made their mind up, so I'm not gonna give my solution. They've already made their mind up. Now, one of the things that I coach a lot of leaders to do instead of brainstorming, what you can do is called brain writing. So say you have an issue that your team is struggling with, have each person write down 3 to 5 different ideas and then bring that to the next meeting and then do a round robin. So this does a couple different things. It allows people to think and reflect on the issue. It also allows them to come up with different ideas. And because you do a round robin style, it allows anyone from those that are very, very quiet to those that are very, very loud, and it puts them on the same playing field. Now, sometimes if you just have a quick problem you want to solve, I always like to do the professor's pause. I guarantee you, if you pause long enough, somebody will say something. Silence can be very uncomfortable for folks. So if you throw this out, you do the professor's pause, it will initiate some conversation. And this is one of the other great quotes I like from Amy Edmondson. Simon Sinek wrote a book called Great Leaders Eat Last. Amy Edmondson, Great Leaders Speak Last. They're able to pull ideas from their team. So we've got ask and pause. The second one is reward risk. So if somebody tries something different, we don't punish failure. We look at it as a learning opportunity, being able to recognize and praise team members who come up with different ideas. Years ago, I was working under the director of quality. I was a training coordinator at the time. And I wanted to redo our annual training. It was the type of training that was so boring that you'd rather like stab your eye out with a fork than go to. I'm sure some of you have been to some of those. And I said, hey, there's a really good idea from a hospital that I learned about within my Association of Talent Development magazine. They had nurses answer some competency questions. And as long as they were able to answer those competency questions, they didn't have to take the training. I said, could we do that here? And so she looked up and she said, hey, we can't because of the regulations. Now, if she just would have kept it there and not said anything else, I probably would have stopped trying. But she said, hey, just because we couldn't accept this idea doesn't mean I want you to stop coming up with ideas. Let's keep coming up with ideas until we find something that fits. And so we did, and we ended up being able to redo the annual training so that it was kind of a choose your own adventure type thing. And it ended up really well. She was able to reward risk in different ways of trying, be able to empower your team to make different decisions, be able to delegate responsibility with progress. And now I always like this acronym FAIL. So first attempt in learning. When I was doing some training, I was doing some training for some firefighters the other day, and they like to give each other a lot of crap. They kind of rib each other quite a bit. And they're like, Molly, we came up with a different acronym. I was like, okay. They're like, yeah, some of our guys are slow. And I said, okay. They're like, we decided SAIL. And I was like, really? They're like several attempts in learning. So whether it's fail or whether it's fail, being able to try different things makes a difference. So be able to role model. I think this is one of the most powerful things that leaders can do. And I'll share a story of one of the best leaders that I've worked under. Years ago, I was speaking at a conference and I reported to the CEO at that time, and she was speaking at the same conference. Now, I was speaking at 7 a.m., she was speaking at 10 a.m. She didn't make my session, which was fine. But before the session, she sat down with me and she said, hey, I've spoke for 20 years, but the last 2 years I haven't gotten out and spoke because this was right after COVID. She said, what I would really appreciate is if you would write down and give me some feedback, not as someone that reports to me, but as a peer. I won't ask you for it today, but just if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. So I said, okay. So she starts her talk and she can work a stage, she can tell a story, she has wonderful inflection. But I noticed, and I probably was a little bit more sensitive to this than the general audience, that she was using some filler words. So sometimes, I don't know if you've seen speakers say, or she was saying right after a lot of different stuff. And I noticed it just because 2 weeks prior, I listened to a video of myself saying right quite a bit within a training. So I started making some tally marks, not as a, oh, I gotcha, but she's asked me to provide feedback. So I wanted to provide her specific feedback like she asked. So she gets done and she says, hey, would you like to go to coffee? It's like, sure. So we start talking about different speaking gigs, different consulting gigs. And then she was like, well, how did I do? And in the back of my mind, I'm going, I thought you weren't going to ask me that today. So I start off with all the softball type stuff. Oh, I love that story about your son. You did a really good job working the stage, etc. And I said, and she said, yes. I said, I noticed that you were using some filler words. And she looked down, she could see my paper. And she said, I said, write 50 times in 60 minutes. I said, yeah. And then she paused and she said 2 words. And luckily, they weren't, you're fired. That would have been a totally different conversation. She said, thank you. She said, Molly, because I'm in the position that I'm in, people won't hold that mirror up to me. They'll say, oh, Susan, you're such a wonderful speaker. Oh, you did such a great job. They won't give me the feedback I need to be better. Now, think about that. As a leader, if she's open to feedback on something that's so personal to her, I knew at any time I could go to her and say, hey, let's do this project. Hey, I agree with this. Hey, I disagree with that. She was a wonderful role model, right? She was open to risk. She was open to feedback. Being able to share your failures, share stuff that doesn't go well, being able to be vulnerable. You know, Brene Brown says it starts with you. Our ability to be daring leaders will never be greater than our capacity for vulnerability. So think about the last time you said, hey, I was wrong. Hey, here's a time I failed. Here's what I learned from it. The first time I ever did a conflict training, I was so excited to get this training. done. I was working with a community college and we were doing online training. And I was going back and forth on, do I tell a story? Do I not tell a story? It was a personal story versus a professional story. And the minute I got done telling the story, somebody typed in the chat, you need more professional stories. Sometimes we fail, but we learn from that. And if you share that, that makes it so that when people fail or don't do things in your organization the way they should, they're able to learn from it, right? We don't use it as punishment. So say, what am I missing? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? So we've gone over asking and pausing. We've gone over rewarding risk. We've gone over role modeling. The fourth thing to encourage psychological safety is to encourage ongoing learning. So promote different growth opportunities. Be able to learn as a team. I was a director of training for many years at a human healthcare and human service organization. And one of the things that we like to start our teams off with, one, we do an icebreaker question just to get to know each other more. And then we'd always watch videos together and we'd always send out different articles. So we were always learning and continuing to evolve as a team. Being able to make learning a part of your regular check-ins. So on my website, LEADERNship.com, so it's leadership with an N, I have a 6T coaching PDF. And it talks about, what are your troubles? What are your triumphs? Training. What do you want to learn? Being able to have those consistent conversations with folks. And then as a leader, share your personal learning plan. What are you learning? What are you reading? The leader that I talked about earlier, she would always, after our check-ins, tell me which book she was reading. Being able to share that makes a big difference. So now I always think of trust and psychological safety like a marble jar, right? It takes a lot of little things to fill it up, but it can also just take one fell swoop to knock it over. But there's a big difference between trust and psychological safety. So the difference between trust and psychological safety is you can trust someone, but you may not feel psychologically safe with them. But you can't feel psychologically safe without trust. So let me give you an example. Years ago, I worked under a director, and she was one of those folks. I don't know if you know them, but they're never wrong, even when they're wrong. And I still remember one time she had tasked myself and my coworker with doing some strategic planning. And I wasn't quite sure what she was asking. So I called my coworker and I was like, do you know what she is asking for? And she was like, no, do you? And I was like, no. I was like, will you call her? No. Will you call her? No. We were too afraid to ask. Now I trusted her. She was good at her job. She knew the regs inside and out, really good at her job. I trusted her with that, but we didn't feel psychologically safe. So we need trust and psychological safety. So what are some other actionable ideas that you can do to create psychological safety? Again, we talked about instead of brainstorming, the brain writing using a round robin. You can go to Liberating Structures. So liberatingstructures.com has a lot of really good team ideas. And the ideas behind Liberating Structures is to get everybody involved. And being able to have those structured, candid conversations can help create psychological safety. So we've got just a couple minutes left. And before we take some comments, thoughts, ideas, yes, the question mark is backwards on here. And there's a reason that I keep it on here backwards. What was it? Last spring, I was doing a psychological safety training for the Association of Talent Development. And I got to the end of the conversation and I had this image on here. About a week later, I got an email from a gentleman that said, hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. I would really like to share it with my team. And then he said, hey, I probably shouldn't say this to you since I'm asking for your presentation, but was the question mark backwards on your presentation? And did the lady, I had a lady that was in like a Vegas hotel room in one of my slides. And he's like, did she have six fingers? He's like, I don't mean to be mean. He's like, but I just thought maybe you don't know the kind of the particulars of AI and AI image generation. So I thought that I would point that out to you because the content was great, but I found it really distracting. And I thought, how cool is that? Usually I don't get to see, the impact of psychological safety, but he felt safe enough to say, hey, here's what I noticed. Here's why you might fix it. He didn't tell me how, but I thought that was really neat. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen here. What questions, thoughts, ideas have come up? You can put them in the chat.
While we wait for any questions or comments from Molly, I just ask that you please stay on for a quick poll that will pop up on your screen once we are completed. Here is a brief evaluation of today's session. I also want to let you know that this session is a 30-minute teaser for Molly's full session that she mentioned can be up to an hour to 3 hours. And that is available to bring into your organization. Contact any of us at NACC Business and Community Solutions, or my contact information is in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues anytime for more information on Molly's topic today or any of our upcoming webinars. I do see one question in the Q&A, Molly, if you can see
Really
that.
good question. So for those that don't see it, it says, I'm a new leader for a team that has gone through a lot with their last leader, or as I call it, probably bad boss trauma. And it's evident that they're scared to contribute. How long does it take to develop trust? That's a really good question. And I would say you can do some proactive things to create trust. So spending time together, doing the icebreaker questions, just being consistent and following up, allowing them to speak, asking questions, listening. It depends on the team. Sometimes if they've had a bad boss for a long period of time, it might take a little bit longer, but the more consistent you can be, the quicker you'll be able to develop that trust. And the more you use the rewarding risk and being able to ask questions, the quicker you'll be able to develop that. Okay.
There's another question in chat from Miriam. It says, what should you do if you aren't feeling psychological safety from a supervisor, but you haven't identified the source?
That's a good question. And I think there can be a couple different answers to that. So maybe, asking them, having a conversation with them. If you're not comfortable with that, sometimes asking a question in front of a group can help. So saying, hey, a lot of times bosses care about outcomes and saying, hey, we really want to make sure that we have the best outcomes we can. Are you willing and able to listen to some of the suggestions that we have? And if you ask that sometimes in a group setting, that can help. So we've got a couple other questions
a couple
here.
others if you want to go through those as well.
Yeah. How do you develop this for teams that are remote? Yep, great question. So the training team that I directed for quite a few years was all remote. I had people all across Iowa, and we met twice a month. One of the things I did a couple things to establish trust. In the first couple minutes of the meeting, I would always ask some fun icebreaker question. I know it sounds silly, but I will tell you that we had somebody join our team that was new, and it made a huge difference. He said, I didn't realize, I was going to feel as safe as I was so quickly within the team. I had worked with a gal for years, and by asking certain questions like, what's your favorite food that has a memory tied to it? Or what would your pets be if they had a human job or something like that? You get to establish that trust and you get to know each other. I would also say carving out time to meet with them one on one. So I met with them at least quarterly one on one. And sometimes we talked about work and sometimes we just talked about random stuff, their family. I had one gal that lived in a underground house. I mean, just random stuff. So being able to share that time makes a big difference. And I always say consciously creating those connections makes a huge difference. Yeah, so we've got a couple other ones on how do you regain their trust and build psychological safety. And I think we kind of answered that with, being consistent, asking for their input. Uh, How do you build relationships while maintaining a balance between personal and professional? It's a hard one. And I think that's especially hard for leaders that have gone from a peer to a leader. And just being able to say, hey, I care about you as a person, but we may not be able to do those, you know, going out after work for a beer, right? That drawing those lines can be hard. So I was going to say I do have a training on, what do new leaders need to do for the first 90 days or so, but I think we're at our
We are at our 30 minutes. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And thank you, Molly, for your insights on psychological safety. Again, if any of you would like to have more information from Molly or a more in-depth training with Molly and your team, let me know. Reach out to NICC Business and Community Solutions. And we thank you for your time today.
Thank you.